I'm Steve Wilson. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Exabeam, which is a leader in AI-driven security operations. I'm also the project lead for the OWASP Top 10 security issues for large language models in the Gen AI space. And I'm the author of O'Reilly's Developer's Playbook for large language model security.
Oh, fantastic. Steve, we're so glad to have you with us here today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Steve, let's talk about big picture problem space. What brings the organizations that you connect with into the world of confidential computing? What are they concerned about?
So I think I really got invited to the summit because I'm an expert in AI security more than confidential computing. And so a lot of my discussions here this week have been around where the intersection of those two things going to be. And I think there are some very clear use cases in protecting things like AI training grounds using confidential computing. But I think going forward, there's a lot more opportunity with what is enabled by confidential computing that hasn't really been realized yet.
Tell us about that. What are you most excited about that's enabled?
Well, when I look at what I do in the Gen AI security space, one of the things that my group does in open source is we've developed the top 10 security issues related to generative AI. And I'd say today about 5 of them, today's confidential computing technologies have applicability to them. But the other 5 are things that confidential computing would need to be extended to grow into, and that the frameworks would need to be developed. And some of them are things like the software supply chain for generative AI applications. You start with these large pre-trained foundation models, and sometimes those are places like at OpenAI behind a firewall. You trust somebody that they're taking care of that. More and more often, people are getting open source ones from sites like Hugging Face. And it's been seen that those don't have good provenance. You don't know where they've come from. You don't know where they've been. And the same thing is true for the increasingly large sets of training data that people are acquiring. And so we had an interesting chat at the panel session I was on earlier about what would we have to do to extend cryptographic controls and software contracts to account for some of these things. I think that's a big opportunity. I think that the ability for large language models to be a trustworthy participant in a confidential computing environment is very limited today. To be blunt, large language models are pretty dumb. And I tell people developing software with them, you have to treat them somewhere between a confused deputy and an enemy sleeper agent. And I think there's a lot of potential for the confidential computing framework to start to insert itself into those transactions, but it doesn't yet.
What do you recommend for IT leaders? Tell us a little bit more about an appropriate response to that scenario, both now and in anticipation of improved security practices.
Well, I think for IT leaders out there, the thing that you want to think about today is obviously more and more people in the, let's call it the enterprise space, are dependent on their hardware being owned by somebody else, right? You're working in cloud computing environments. And so you need to think about your cloud computing environment and how are you enabled to transfer some or all of your workloads related to AI into that environment. And what are the costs going to be? What are the hurdles going to be? Is your software going to be improved or be enabled in that? And I think, one of the things that my company sees is we're completely based in the cloud. And, we work with Google's cloud, and Google does have a confidential computing offering, which allows us to start to experiment with that. And I think, many years ago, people would start to think about, okay, do I buy the right Intel chips that are going to have this enabled? It's more going to be about the software layers and how do you enable this so that it's transparent to your software developers who really don't want to understand this.
So I need to worry about both the model, especially if it's an open source one, and the hyperscaler that I'm running it on.
Absolutely. And I think the good news is, as your hyperscalers mature in their ability to host and protect these models, they can be your best partner in securing them. And they also are the ones that are going to have the most ability to insert these very low-level technologies like confidential computing into the stack, where maybe the customer themselves actually can't do that without working hand in hand with their cloud provider anymore.
And presumably that will enable new levels of innovation and experimentation with emerging models and technologies.
I think that's the key thing, is that as long as we put these big security problems firmly on the shoulder of software developers who are not good at security and not interested in security, the applicability of these things is going to be really limited. The idea that we can build more and more of this trustworthiness into the lower layers of the infrastructure, where the development teams can inherit it for free, or at least pay as you go, that opens up a lot of innovation.
What's the most counterintuitive or surprising of the 10 top threats?
I think one of the ones that's the most challenging for people to get their head around is what we call excessive agency. And the reason this is challenging is it's not what people typically think of as a security vulnerability, but it's become one of the most popular to talk about. And the idea is, when you start to think about the fact that you are putting something that feels much more like a human into the mix, when we talk about agency, it's how much do you give it unsupervised control of different aspects. And again, when you realize that these things are not trustworthy, that they're not reliable, but they often seem like they are. They seem very bright and they speak very well, but they're often not trustworthy. And what this means is that they could, if you gave them the ability to execute financial transactions, could they be duped into executing the wrong financial transaction, translate to my bank account, not his bank account? And the fun example I just used for everyone is it's about, at some level, the design of what you're going to enable that LLM to do. And if you think about a movie like 2001, everybody knows HAL. If you haven't watched it lately, HAL sounds exactly like GPT-4. Why did HAL have the agency to turn off the crew's life support systems? Simply something he shouldn't have been able to do, and that would have saved everyone a lot of problems.